So most of Paine's ideas were not uncommon, but what made common sense unique was his mode of expressing them and the audience he addressed. Previous political writings like Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania were directed toward the educated elite. Paine pioneered a new style of political writing, one designed to expand dramatically the public sphere where political discussion took place. He wrote clearly and directly, and he avoided the complex language and Latin phrases common in pamphlets aimed at educated readers. Common Sense was wildly successful and sold an estimated 150,000 copies. Paine voiced opinions already felt by many. In the spring of 1776, scores of American communities adopted resolutions calling for a separation from Britain. Only 6 months elapsed between the appearance of Common Sense and the decision by the Second Continental Congress to sever the colony's ties with Great Britain. Richard Henry Lee stood before the Second Continental Congress and presented the motion, quote, "Resolved, that these United Colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved." The resolution also called for a formation of foreign alliances and the creation of an outline for a united confederation for the colonies' consideration. Lee saw the importance of independence and the colonists' need to form alliances with foreign powers to achieve that goal. The debate for independence, therefore, involved more than a decision to break from England. Independence meant forming alliances, possibly with Great Britain's enemies in Europe, setting up a government for the colonies, and most importantly, getting the delegates to accept and agree to the terms of separation and confederation. For Lee and his allies in Congress, independence seemed logical, as England continued to ignore, quote, "the repeated petitions for peace, liberty, and safety sent over the previous decade." However, Congress postponed the debate on Virginia's resolution until the 1st of July. In case the vote for independence carried, Congress appointed a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence, modeled after the resolution for Congress's consideration. The committee comprised of several colonists, with Thomas Jefferson representing Virginia as the principal drafter. In early July, debates began. As debates continued, Congress began picking apart Jefferson's declaration in the hopes of reaching agreement between the colonies. One of the most devastating blows to Jefferson came when Congress moved his passage condemning slavery, primarily for the people of South Carolina and Georgia. Without unanimity, the resolution on independence would not pass, so the colony's patriarchs erased the recognition of oppression and moved on to other issues. The decision disappointed Jefferson, but he never actively pursued eradicating slavery, partly due to his own overwhelming debt. On the 2nd of July, after repeated edits to the Declaration of Independence, Congress agreed to Lee's resolution, and 2 days later, the last delegates signed the declaration and ordered copies sent to assemblies, committees, and conventions, as well as to the Continental Army. Because the resolution was passed on July 2nd, John Adams believed that that day, and not the 4th, would be, quote, "the most memorable day in the history of America," and he believed it would be celebrated yearly. Declaring independence was one thing. Winning independence was another. The newly created American Army confronted the greatest military power on earth. Viewing the Americans as traitors, Britain resolved to crush the rebellion. The Americans had to rely on local militias and an inadequately equipped Continental Army. Despite British power and American inexperience, to conquer the 13 colonies would be an enormous and expensive task. European rivals, notably France, welcomed the prospect of a British defeat. If the Americans could forge an alliance with France, a world power second only to Britain, it would go a long way toward equalizing the balance of forces. I want to briefly talk about African Americans' military involvement in the Revolution. We will discuss the African American free and enslaved experience in greater detail next week. At the war's outset, George Washington refused to accept black recruits. But he changed his mind after Lord Dunmore, Virginia's royal governor, issued a proclamation in 1775, which offered freedom to slaves who joined the British cause. For the American side, some 5,000 African Americans enlisted in state militias and the Continental Army and Navy. Since individuals drafted into the militia were allowed to provide a substitute, slaves suddenly gained considerable bargaining power. Many slaves acquired their freedom by agreeing to serve in the place of an owner or his or her son. In 1778, Rhode Island formed a black regiment and promised freedom to slaves who enlisted while compensating the owners for their loss of property. Blacks who fought under George Washington and in other state militias did so in integrated companies, although invariably under white officers. They were the last black soldiers to do so officially until the Korean War, with the exception of irregular units that fought toward the end of World War II. So think about that, 1778 till the mid-20th century, before groups are integrated again in the military. Except for South Carolina and Georgia, Southern colonies also enrolled free blacks and slaves to fight. They were not explicitly promised freedom, but many received it individually after the war ended. In 1783, Virginia emancipated slaves who had, quote, contributed towards the establishment of American liberty and independence by serving in the army. Fighting on the side of the British also offered opportunities for freedom. During the war, blacks fought with the British in campaigns in New York, New Jersey, and South Carolina. Other escaped slaves served in the Royal Army as spies, guided their troops through swamps, and worked as military cooks, laundresses, and construction workers. Had the British commander, Sir William Howe, prosecuted the war more vigorously at the outset, he might have nipped the rebellion in the bud by destroying Washington's army. But while Washington suffered numerous defeats in the first years of the war, he generally avoided direct confrontations with the British and managed to keep his army intact. Demoralized by successive failures, many soldiers simply went home. Once 28,000 men, Washington's army dwindled to fewer than 3,000. Indeed, Washington feared that without a decisive victory, it would melt away entirely. To restore morale and regain the initiative, he launched successful surprise attacks in Trenton, New Jersey in late 1776, and in Princeton in July of 1777. It was the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in October of 1777 that provided a significant boost to American morale. Saratoga helped to persuade the French that American victory was possible. In 1776, American diplomats, led by Benjamin Franklin, created a treaty of amity and commerce in which France recognized the United States and agreed to supply military assistance. Still smarting from their defeat in the 7 Years' War, the French hoped to weaken Britain, their main European adversary. Soon afterward, Spain also joined the war on the American side. French and Spanish entry transformed the war for independence into a global conflict. By putting Britain on the defensive in territories on and off the mainland, it greatly complicated their military prospects. In 1778, the war shifted to the south. Here, the British hoped to exploit the social tensions between backcountry farmers and wealthy planters to enlist the support of the numerous colonists in the region who remained loyal to the crown. Another aim was to disrupt the economy by encouraging slaves to escape. In December 1778, British forces occupied Savannah, Georgia, and in May 1780 they captured Charleston, South Carolina, and with it an American army of 5,000 men. The year 1780 was arguably the low point of the struggle for independence. Congress was essentially bankrupt, and the army went months without being paid. The British seemed successful in playing upon social conflicts within the colonies, as thousands of Southern Loyalists joined up with British forces, 14 regiments in Savannah alone, and tens of thousands of slaves sought freedom by fleeing to British lines. But the British failed to turn these and other advantages into victory. There we go. I was having a little bit of a technical issue. There we go. All right. British commanders were unable to consolidate their hold on the South. Hit-and-run attacks from American militiamen eroded the British position in South Carolina. A bloody civil war engulfed North and South Carolina and Georgia, with Patriot and Loyalist militias inflicting retribution on each other and plundering the farms of their opponents' supporters. The brutal treatment of civilians by British forces under Colonel Banastre Tarleton persuaded many Americans to join the Patriot cause. In 1781, American forces defeated the British at Cowpen, South Carolina, and Guilford Courthouse, North Carolina, driving British forces north into Virginia. When British commander Lord Cornwallis camped out at Yorktown, Washington recognized an opportunity to surround Cornwallis on the peninsula. Washington rushed his forces, augmented by French troops under the Marquis de Lafayette, to block the British escape by land. Meanwhile, a French fleet controlled the mouth of the Chesapeake, preventing supplies and reinforcements from reaching Cornwallis's army. Imperial rivalries had helped to create the American colonies. Now, the rivalry of European empires helped to secure American independence. Taking land and sea forces together, more Frenchmen than Americans participated in the decisive Yorktown campaign. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army of 8,000 men. When the news reached London, public support for the war evaporated and peace negotiations began. Britain abandoned the struggle and focused instead on the economically valuable West Indies. 2 years later, in September of 1783, American and British negotiators concluded the Treaty of Paris, and this is a picture of the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The American delegation, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay, achieved one of the greatest diplomatic triumphs in the country's history. They not only won recognition of American independence, but also gained control of the entire region between Canada and Florida, east of the Mississippi River. At British insistence, the Americans agreed that colonists who had remained loyal to the mother country would not suffer persecution, and that Loyalist property that had been seized would be restored. With the Treaty of Paris, the United States of America became the Western Hemisphere's first independent nation. Its boundaries reflected not so much the long-standing unity of the geographical region, but the circumstances of its birth. And next week we are going to talk about the revolution within. So, this is sort of the story that you're familiar with, what I've just told you. Next week we're going to talk about how the revolution affected women and Native Americans and African Americans and, not the political elites, but the poorer farmers and all those guys that you don't usually get to talk about when you talk about this stuff. So we're going to talk about that next week.